The wide world of DACs and amps keeps getting bigger and bigger. There's seemingly no end to the constant release cycle. Every few months, there's another DAC or amp to replace the ones just before. Topping and SMSL are notorious for constantly churning out products, and once again, I have a few topping products to review. Shenzhen Audio sent me the E50 and L50 to review. The E50 is a $270 DAC and the L50 is a $230 amplifier. By the way, Shenzhen Audio and I have a continuing relationship where they allow me to review gear from time to time. If you're looking for some exotic stuff along with the mundane, Shenzhen Audio is worth visiting. You might be surprised to see some products on their website. So, are the E50 and L50 rinse and repeat from topping, or something fresh? The E50 and L50 are supposedly designed for professional use. That may not be obvious from the looks, but the overall structure of these devices does seem to indicate that this stack is intended for professionals. The E50 uses the ES9068AS chipset. This is one of the newest DACs in the market. According to ESS, the 9068AS was, quote, designed for professional applications such as mixer consoles and digital audio workstations, and also for consumer products. The E50 supports all PCM decoding up to 32-bit, full MQA rendering, and up to DSD512. It has coaxial, optical, and USB input, and the E50 supports both single-ended RCA output and balanced quarter-inch output. That's right, I said quarter-inch balanced output. This is very rare in modern DACs and amplifiers. This is something that Topping has done in the past, and I'm not sure why they opted for it. I know that some professionals use gear that has quarter-inch balanced inputs and outputs, so maybe Topping was merely trying to blend in. Topping says you cannot use the quarter-inch output of the E50 to send unbalanced signal. In other words, you cannot adapt the E50's quarter-inch to single-ended. If you're tempted to connect your headphones directly into the back of the E50's quarter-inch, you'll be in for an unpleasant surprise. The E50's design was hand-in-hand with the L50. That's why both of these products have quarter-inch balanced connections. You can use an XLR to quarter-inch TRS adapter for the L50. So you're not necessarily forced to use the E50. You can use another DAC that has only XLR balanced output, but you will still need to buy additional cables or adapters. This, in my view, just seems to be unnecessary cost and complexity. On the front, the L50 has single-ended quarter-inch and balanced XLR out for your headphones. You can also toggle between single-ended and balanced and between the gain settings. Interestingly, the L50 has a USB-C connection on the back for firmware updates. As far as I know, the L50 currently does not have a firmware update. As for power output, the L50 provides a whopping 3.5 watts at 16 ohms, 2.8 watts at 32 ohms, 2 watts at 64 ohms, 540 milliwatts at 300 ohms, and 290 milliwatts at 600 ohms. Clearly, this amp has a lot of power for any application. As for build, both devices are fairly mundane. They look like the older E30 and L30. They are well built and sturdy, however. Both the L50 and E50 are simple to use. These are no-frill products and should be plug and play with each other and also with your gear. Overall, the E50 and L30 must be paired together. It doesn't make much sense to buy the E50 alone unless you already have an amplifier that accepts quarter-inch TRS input for balanced input. I think the use of quarter-inch TRS is odd. It's not typical for audiophile gear. However, buying a TRS cable is not difficult. You can find them for under $10 on Amazon, so it's not exactly a burdensome expense, but it is an additional expenditure nonetheless. I frankly don't have any complaints regarding the features or the build. When I review DACs and amplifiers, I pit them against alternatives. I try to answer a few simple questions. First, what is the sound signature of the product? Second, does the product sound noticeably different from alternatives? I do not talk about emotional response and I do not talk about dynamics because both of these things are unhelpful subjective vagaries. To test the L50 and E50, I conducted numerous tests. Initially, I listened to them together as a stack. I used a wide swath of headphones. This included my Allo Audio S4X, Sennheiser HD6XX, audeze LCD1, and the LCD2 Classic, the Avantone Planar, the Beyerdynamic T1 2nd Gen, and the Modhouse Argon. The idea was to determine two things. First, if this stack provided sufficient power to drive all of these headphones at their peak performance, which varies from headphone to headphone. Second, if there was any noticeable alteration of performance between the L50's single-ended and balanced outputs. I then compared the units separately. I set up A/B test on the E50. I used it against the Soncause LAQXD1 and the DAC output of the topping EX5. For these tests, I plugged each device into my PC and then used Voicemeeter Banana to send signal to both DACs at the same time. I connected these DACs through their RCA output to the Rupert Neve headphone amplifier and the Schiit Magni Heresy. I volume matched the DACs through Voicemeeter and listened to my test tracks on Amazon Music HD. I conducted a similar test using the L50. I compared the L50 to the RNHP and the Schiit Heresy. This time, I plugged the LAQXD1 and the E50 alternately into these amplifiers. The goal was to determine if the amplifiers sounded differently from each other. Finally, I compared the E50 and L50 stack against the topping EX5. This provided a good comparison between an all-in-one solution like the EX5. So, what are my overall conclusions? Well, as far as the E50 and L50 stack, I can say that my initial impression was this is a neutral combination. Neither product seems to cause audible noise in the signal. The stack worked perfectly with all my test headphones. I could not hear any immediate alteration of the sound signatures of my headphones using this stack. I next conducted my test of the E50 against the alternative DACs. I plugged them into my PC and used Voicemeeter to send signal to both at once. I connected the DACs to a passive AB switch which sent signal to my test amps. This included the Schiit Heresy and the RNHP. I used several headphones for this process, including the HD6XX and the Avantone Planar, among others. Volume matching was pretty easy. The bottom line is that the E50 had no noticeable difference in sound or performance when compared against the Soncause and the EX5. There was no alteration in any of the frequency range. Switching back and forth, repeating tracks, and trying new tracks all resulted in the same conclusion. The E50 is neutral. And, just as importantly, it sounds identical to the comparison DACs. While some people might argue that the E50 has more of whatever, that is subject to strict testing methodology. And when we do real A/B tests, we tend to put our preconceptions under examination. This process shows that the E50 has no audible difference in performance from the competitors I tested here. I did similar tests with the L50. I used the E50 as the source this time. I plugged the L50, the RNHP, and the Heresy into a passive AB switch from the E50. I then used another switch for the headphone outputs. Back and forth, countless times, I listened to the L50 versus these alternatives. There was no immediate difference. After lengthy periods of listening, say 10 minutes or more, and then switching back to the other amplifier, I still could not perceive any audible difference in sound. The L50 is as neutral as the Heresy and the RNHP. On the one hand, you might say that this is an amazing achievement, that the roughly $200 L50 can compete with a $500 RNHP. But that argument is premised on the assumption that the more you pay, the better the sound is. This is not the case. While the RNHP has intriguing build and topology, at the end of the day, it's an amplifier just like any other in function. In other words, I caution anybody against hyping the L50's performance just because it sounds like a $500 amp. After all, the Heresy also sounds the same, and it is cheaper than the L50. So, ultimately, the L50 is neutral as the competitors. I also tested the L50 and E50 as a stack configuration against the EX5. I once again used Voicemeeter to send signal to both DACs at once. I used a passive AB switch to test the sound on my headphones. And once volume matched, there was no audible difference whatsoever in the sound signature. You could close your eyes and someone might switch inputs without your knowledge, and you would have no idea which product you were listening to. Back and forth, song after song, I tested these products head to head, and there was not a single noticeable difference. Finally, I retested the L50 and E50 stack together with their balanced connection. As I said earlier, this DAC requires a TRS quarter-inch connection for balanced output. You cannot use adapters, and I easily found a cable on Amazon to do this. I could not hear any obvious difference in noise between the single-ended and balanced connections on this stack. And obviously, there was no influence on the sound signature when using balanced connection. Balanced topography does not change the sound, it merely provides lower noise and distortion and greater power. Of course, the vast majority of modern products have noise and distortion performance that is far, far below anything a human could ever hear. Overall, the E50 and L50 are neutral, separate, and together. They work as well as the competitors I tested. Neither does anything groundbreaking, breathtaking, or earth-shattering. These are good products, along with many others. Topping says that the L50 provides 3.5 watts into 16 ohms, 2.8 watts into 32 ohms, and etc., etc. You can look up the numbers online. We have seen time and again that Topping and SMSL fudge their power output measurements by using DACs that output higher voltage than other DACs available to the rest of us. According to Topping's own marketing, it looks like Topping used a DAC with about 5 VRMS to get the high power output measurements of the L50. Of course, they don't say what DAC they used. The E50's marketing says that this DAC has just above 4 VRMS maximum voltage, so clearly this is not the DAC Topping used to measure the L50 with. This is where websites like Audio Science Review might become relevant and helpful. ASR measured the L50 using voltage slightly below 4 VRMS and 2 VRMS. ASR measurements give us an odd result. ASR says that the L50 provides 3.2 watts at 33 ohms and 636 milliwatts at 300 ohms. Compare this to Topping's reference material. Topping quotes 2.8 watts into 32 ohms and 540 milliwatts into 300 ohms. So ASR measured higher than Topping, but Topping ostensibly used a DAC with higher voltage than what ASR used. Now look, I anticipated there would be a discrepancy about power output, but I was not expecting this discrepancy. Of course, ASR did not address this odd inconsistency, and this is typical of ASR and leaves the rest of us confused about the overall performance and veracity of the measurements from both sources. Whatever the actual power output of the L50 is, I can confirm that it's more than enough for any headphone you might have or even want. There is no conceivable reason to have 3.5 watts at 16 ohms or 2.8 watts at 32 ohms, but you've got it. The L50 is capable of easily driving dynamic and planar headphones, and yes, this includes the Modhouse Argon. I know it can be confusing to decide which DAC or amplifier to buy. There are so many options and so much hype for all of them that it becomes nearly impossible to sift through the crap to get to the truth. I have no idea what ESS and AKM are up to, well, at least before AKM lost its factory. Their DAC war is ridiculous because it doesn't result in anything materially useful for the consumer. While the measure-oriented can wax poetic about how these products look on graphs, those of us who just want something that works and is affordable are left to scavenge for reliable information. DACs don't sound better just because they happen to be the newest thing in the market. They don't have different sound just because they've been shoehorned into another metal box with a higher model number. That's not how components work. So when I see hype behind DACs and amps, I get really concerned. These things do far less than you're led to believe from certain corners. When we look at the L50 and E50, we're left with a somewhat confusing picture. On the one hand, this DAC is capable, seemingly reliable, neutral, and powerful. The only thing that the E50 lacks is, frankly, Bluetooth. Otherwise, it's got every form of high-resolution support from PCM to DSD. It even has MQA decoding. If you do not want Bluetooth in your DAC, then the E50 comes jam-packed with everything else. The L50 is a perfectly good product. It's small, but in exchange, you have to lug around a giant power adapter. It's got balanced and single-ended connection. It's neutral. It can drive any headphone you can think of. Individually, the L50 and E50 make a strong case for themselves, especially at their price tags. But when you buy the stack together, oddly, they kind of get in each other's way. You're forced to use the quarter-inch balance connection, which is just not something you see in audiophile gear. Sure, it's in professional products, but Topping really isn't a manufacturer of professional-grade amplifiers and DACs. Honestly, I don't understand the rationale for the quarter-inch output and input. Perhaps it was intended to save space and minimize footprint, or just to save cost. If you buy the E50, you can connect it to something like the RNHP without difficulty. The RNHP will accept either quarter-inch or XLR balanced. Use whatever cable you have lying around. But if you try to connect the E50 to an amp that accepts only balanced XLR input or the single-ended RCA, then you'll need to get an adapter for the quarter-inch to the XLR. The same goes for the L50. While you can use the L50 with a DAC that outputs balanced only through XLR, you will need an adapter. And what happens when in the future manufacturers start moving away from the bulky XLR connection to the more compact 4.4mm output? Maybe someone will have a 4.4mm to TRS quarter-inch adapter, but you never really know. So the longevity of the quarter-inch TRS design is a little suspect. I get it, this is a small issue, it's minor, but it's still something odd, in my opinion. All of this brings us to value. Individually, I think the E50 and L50 make strong arguments for themselves. I can say that both individually are value at their current price points. I still think that the Heresy is a cheaper alternative that is better for new audiophiles. But as I've been told repeatedly, the cost of Schiit's products in Europe and Asia is cost prohibitive, and that's where Topping and SMSL seem to be more competitive. I struggle a little bit about the E50. I mean, it's nearly $300 and does what the Soundcause does. The price difference between these two is not significant, about $50, but the Soundcause does not have the quarter-inch balance connection issue. You can just plug that thing into any amplifier. On the other hand, the E50 does have MQA support, which the Soundcause lacks. The real issue, in my view, is the L50 and E50 as a stack, put together. If you buy both, you'll spend $500. But the Topping EX5 is $350. It's an all-in-one solution. It's got balanced and single-ended connection, a perfectly good DAC, a powerful amplifier, support for all high-resolution audio, decodes MQA, and has Bluetooth included. That's a lot of features for $150 less than the L50 and E50 stack. You could argue that the E stack has vastly greater power to provide, and that's true. I suppose you'll have to decide if you need that type of power and whether it's worth the price difference. Ultimately, the E50 and L50 are good products. Topping made some confusing decisions here, but nothing that should keep them off your list of potential options.